Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Merrill Ward, and I'm absolutely delighted and honored to have been chosen to moderate this next panel discussion entitled 5-MeO-DMT, Ethics, Practices, Research, and the Science of Spirituality. Do we have the slides up? Oh, is it? No, you're running it from your end. Sorry. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with this extraordinary and intriguing molecule, let me briefly provide you with a little bit of background. Hopefully we'll have a couple of images for you. 5-MeO-DMT is a psychedelic of the tryptamine class found in a wide variety of plant species throughout the world, and perhaps surprisingly, in one species of amphibian, the Sonoran Desert or Colorado River toad, also known as the Bufo or Encilius alvarius toad. Let's see if I can get it up for you. We're almost there. Point it that way. That's probably why. Can you bring me up the next slide, please? Thank you very much. And perhaps most intriguingly, it is known to exist endogenously within all mammals, including all human beings, along with its better-known cousin, N,N-dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. It's been traditionally used by various indigenous peoples throughout both Central and South America for millennia as a psychoactive snuff, more commonly known as yopo. Like other tryptamines, 5-MeO-DMT is an indole alkaloid molecule, has the same basic indole ring structure as DMT with the addition of a methoxy group in the R5 position. It was first synthesized in 1936, and then in 1959 it was isolated as one of the key psychoactive ingredients of yopo snuffs. Those slides coming up? Appreciate it. Within the body, 5-MeO-DMT acts primarily on the serotonin 5-HT system, as we just heard, with a particular binding affinity with the 5-HT1A receptor subtype and trace amine receptors, and has been known to have long-term MAOI effects. 5-MeO-DMT is generally smoked or vaporized or insufflated. Its onset effects when vaporized are essentially instantaneous within mere seconds of ingestion, peaking from 1 to 5 minutes and lasting upwards of 45 minutes depending on the individual. At low threshold dose can be from 1 to 2 milligrams, while a moderate to strong, or what has been called a full release dose of synthetic material, can be anywhere from 5 to 15 milligrams. While officially placed on the DEA's Schedule 1 in January of 2011, within the last several years, 5-MeO-DMT has begun to be used clinically outside of the United States, showing some success in alleviating depression, anxiety, and PTSD. It's also been used as an adjunct to ibogaine addiction treatment to assist recovering patients with integration, and is currently being looked at for future clinical trials here in the United States. Even more research studies from the Dior Institute recently in Brazil showed a clear pattern of results suggesting that 5-MeO-DMT may play a neuroprotective role in the human brain, as well as having significant anti-inflammatory and antidepressant capabilities while increasing the levels of neuroplasticity. Another important study regarding the patterns of use, motives of consumption, and acute subjective effects has also been recently released in partnership with Johns Hopkins University. See if I've got some, I'm still trying to work this. There we go. Let's have it. 5-MeO-DMT has been also researched by several luminaries in the psychedelic movement, including Andrew Weil, Wade Davis, and Jonathan Ott, as well as Ralph Metzner in his book, The Toad and the Jaguar, and Stan Groff, who in the introduction of this work suggests that further study and research of 5-MeO-DMT might prove promising in the treatment of PTSD in war veterans. Within his seminal works, Pikal and Tikal, Sasha Shulgin listed 5-MeO-DMT as one of only 2 substances to induce what he referred to as a +4 experience, defined as a rare and precious transcendental state, a peak or religious experience, a divine transformation, or state of samadhi. While some, especially when utilized in an unsupervised or careless manner, have described its effects as utterly terrifying, revealing the darkest depths of the collective psyche. And yet, paradoxically, some have described these diverse effects as occurring simultaneously. 5-MeO-DMT has become increasingly popular within the underground psychedelic movement recently, especially those seeking a singularly unique spiritual experience. As 5-MeO-DMT has been demonstrated to consistently induce what the Raja Yogins refer to as a nirvikalpa samadhi experience, or a union with divine consciousness that is beyond any doubt or description, effectively eliminating the egoic structure or dissolving the egoic structure to allow the individual to have a direct experience with unitive or divine consciousness. Thus leading it to be referred to as the crown jewel of entheogens and the God molecule. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you 5-MeO-DMT. And now let's meet our distinguished panel. Our first panelist began her career as an oceanographer at Stanford, UCLA, and then right here in the city of Los Angeles, before switching gears as a direct result of a 5-MeO-DMT experience, to dedicating herself to legitimizing psychedelics as medicines. 3.5 years ago, she founded the Los Angeles-based psychedelic society, the AWARE Project, in addition to co-founding Interspace Integration. She worked for a year and a half at the Crossroads Treatment Center in Mexico as a psycho-spiritual retreat leader with Ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT before its closing in 2017. Currently, she's earning her second master's degree, this time in social work, and working as a study coordinator for the MAPSS-sponsored clinical trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of PTSD, on her way to becoming one of the first legal psychedelic therapists. And in her free time, she loves to hula hoop. Please help me welcome Ashley Booth. Since the publication of his book, Tryptamine Palace, 5-MeO-DMT and the Sonoran Desert Toad, which helped me immensely, in 2009, considered by many to be a contemporary psychedelic classic, our next panelist has emerged as one of the leading entheogenic voices of his generation in his attempt to resurrect psychedelic philosophy. An accomplished photographer, an adventure sports journalist, as well as a world-class competitive paraglider pilot, his new book, The Psychedelic Revolution, The Genesis of the Visionary Age, continues to define the parameters of 21st century psychedelic culture through a detailed examination of a multiple of facets of the modern psychedelic experience, with essays as diverse subjects as psychedelics and extreme sports, the relationship between the ego and toxicity, and a history of visionary art that, taken together, document the rise of the new psychedelic revolution and its most important sources. Please welcome my friend, James Oroc. Our next panelist, who unfortunately could not be with us here today, but we're going to hear a little bit of a audio recording of his statement in just a bit, received his master's in mental health counseling from the University of Wyoming. He serves as a board member of the Source Research Foundation and has worked on several research studies regarding 5-MeO-DMT, including the first human observational study and the first global survey study recently released in partnership with Johns Hopkins University. He's also a creator and curator of The 5 Hive, an online harm reduction forum dedicated to the discussion of 5-MeO-DMT and related topics, which can be accessed at 5meodmt.org. He is currently working as a psychedelic-assisted therapist at Innate Path Treatment Center in Denver, Colorado, working with cannabis and ketamine to treat the root causes of PTSD, depression, anxiety, and other mental illnesses. Please welcome, even though he's not here with us right now, Rafael Lancelotta. And our final panelist currently hails from Brooklyn, New York. A graduate of the New School, he is a writer, documentarian, and a scientific researcher who currently studies chemistry and the pharmacology of tryptamines at the University of the Sciences in Philadelphia. Besides being a regular science columnist for Harper's Magazine, he is perhaps best known as the creator and intrepid host of the popular television series Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, which just completed its second successful season. The first episode of which this season was entitled The Psychedelic Toad and focused on the various aspects of the Bufo or Ancilius alvarius toad and the smoking of its venom containing 5-MeO-DMT. Please join me in welcoming Hamilton Morris. So what we want to do to start this out, Rafael was sick and couldn't be with us here today. So he gave us an audio recording of what he'd like to present to the audience today. And so if we're ready, if we can start that audio recording, I'd like to hear some of his points, which are beautifully salient, and it'll start our conversation. Oh, we have a picture too. I don't know. Do you have that, Paul? It was all working so perfectly.
It's just a chance to breathe.
If we don't have that, we will move on. Okay, so yeah, if you get it up, we'll play that in a minute. So if you can continue to working on that. So what I'd like to do to get us started on this particular topic is address a few questions to our panelists, and then what I'm hoping to do is give us about 15 minutes or so for any Q&A. When we get to the Q&A, if folks would just line up in the aisles, we'll be able to get microphones to you much more quickly. So I'm going to start off with specific panelists, but then I want to have our other panelists weigh in if they feel called to do so. So Ashley, I want to start with you, if you wouldn't mind. As someone who's actually worked with 5-MeO-DMT in a clinical setting, in a psychospiritual setting, what do you feel are some of the clinical safety considerations that need to be made in terms of practitioners in regards to 5-MeO-DMT?
That's a huge question.
It is a really huge question.
Well, at Crossroads, what we focused on was creating a safe container for this experience because I'm sure all of us will agree that it's very important to have a experienced practitioner to hold space and know what they're doing to be able to facilitate this experience, and a good solid container to hold it in. So we did it with we had a doctor and a nurse in the room with the practitioner to be able to support people in case there are any kind of medical emergencies. We were being overly cautious about that, and people were being screened before going through the process, but preparation is so key for this because it's such a rapid expanse that you need to be able to have an existing system within yourself to be able to integrate that experience and also to be able to let go. Because once you let go, you're there, but if you get caught in the birth canal, it can be very, very challenging. So helping people prepare for the experience is huge. And then making sure people have an existing system of integrative practices in place before, and then so that they are already ready to use those practices after the fact. So, being also, again, this is a huge, huge question, but knowing people's sensitivities to the medicine, making sure you're not giving people too much medicine that can be really hard on their serotonin system, and if people get too much medicine, if it's not being measured, some facilitators don't measure their medicine out, and so you can kind of blow people out a little bit, and it can might be much, much harder to come back down, be able to integrate back into this plane of existence, and people can continue to feel very expanded. So having a lot of follow-up support after the experience, because even if you have a positive experience, it can still be a lot of integration process. My first time doing the medicine, it was the most positive experience of my life, and yet it still took 1.5 years of a lot of inward practices, Kundalini yoga teacher training, and a lot of reading and working with all sorts of different people to support in this cognitive shift and emotional shift that occurred during that experience.
Great.
Can I ask a quick
Absolutely,
question?
please.
So at Crossroads, you gave the toad venom like 24 hours after the Ibogaine experience? Was that the way it worked?
So at Crossroads we had, well, in the psychospiritual, because there was 2 programs. So there's the addiction program that was for people that were working with addiction, and they would do Ibogaine sort of midweek, and then they would do the toad I wasn't part of that program, so I think it was around 3 days later. For the psychospiritual program, we did Ibogaine experience on Friday night, and then Sunday would be the toad. So it was pretty quick afterwards, but we didn't see any physiological damage being done for people. We were gathering a lot of medical data.
Yeah, I just think people would be in kind of a crushed state from the Ibogaine.
Well, that's, I mean, from what I could see, I mean, Ibogaine really takes people into the like darkness, and you're kind of like working through all of your stuff, and leaves you in this kind of like really open sort of, your ego is tired, which means that your ego has less of a fight for going into the 5-MeO experience. And so from what I could see, it was actually kind of a nice pairing, because you're kind of pairing this medicine that's going back deep into your shadow with this medicine, the toad medicine, that's all about the light. And so to be able to kind of end on that note, plus it's a very reliable medicine, like you're gonna have an experience. Whereas the Ibogaine, it's often hard to get the dosing right for people, and so being able to have that as a way for, you know, if maybe someone didn't have like a huge, or maybe they had a confusing Ibogaine experience, being able to have this kind of emotional, cathartic 5-MeO experience afterwards actually worked quite well.
Thank you, Ashley. I do believe we have the audio for Rafael available, if I could please.
For the people who made it possible for my voice to be heard at this meeting, as I am not able to present at the LAPSS conference, I have been offered the opportunity to share my thoughts and hopefully enrich and stimulate the dialogue and perspectives present today. First, I would like to share my thoughts regarding the use of Bufo alvarius. Based on the information I have received from various locals and ecologists of the area, it is ecologically irresponsible to continue using toad bufotoxin as a means to deliver 5-MeO DMT. It is also important to consider the cultural ramifications that arise from cultural appropriation that appears to be taking place. In regards to the general use of 5-MeO DMT as a clinical tool, it is of utmost importance that the administrator or therapist has a clear and thorough understanding of trauma dynamics, as well as the understanding of somatics and transference as they play out in the psychedelic therapy paradigm. There should also be reasonable medical understanding by the person doing the administration, and finally, a strong emphasis on preparation and integration of the experience outside of the non-ordinary state. As such, my hope for the community as it receives 5-MeO DMT as a medicinal tool of growing popularity is that it develops an attitude of respect, which engenders caution and patience that people may hold back from using until there's an appropriate facilitation or therapeutic context and the individual is fully prepared to be supported in the productive integration of what may arise. Through my observations of the use of 5-MeO DMT, both through personal observation and observation by proxy, I have seen how it can be a powerful tool for bypassing personal processes. It can augment delusions and seems to attract facilitators that are not well qualified due to the short duration of action and ease by which it can be administered. Very high doses of this medicine are often administered in order to produce a phenomenologically incredible yet confusing experience. The risk of confusion or potential harm could increase if repeatedly used without appropriate integration work. 5-MeO DMT holds incredible potential for treating trauma-related disorders such as PTSD, depression, and addiction, and has the advantage of greater portability due to its short duration of action and ease of synthesis. However, I fear that in people's excitement to use this medicine, it will be used in settings that are dangerous or could compromise the safety of those who are using it. This could endanger any regulatory processes that could make 5-MeO DMT widely available as an approved medicine. There continues to be significant debate about toad bufotoxin and synthetic-derived 5-MeO DMT, but based on current anecdotal and scientific information, there is little evidence to suggest that there are significant differences in the benefits between both forms of this medicine. Further, formal clinical and structured research must be done before we are able to appropriately determine the application of this incredible molecule. Thank you, Rafael.
Yeah,
That's great.
there was a lot of issues there. Ashley, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I want to jump in on the transference part.
Yep.
Because I think it relates to the importance of the dynamics between a practitioner and the person that's receiving the medicine. When people come out of this medicine, they're like a newborn child or like a baby duckling, and they are going to imprint on anyone that's around them. And so what I've sort of seen is people, and I think that this is true for a lot of entheogen and practitioners, is that people imprint on the person that they do the experience with the first time, and they will defend that person even if they don't maybe have the best practices.
Psychedelic Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah.
So, as the advice that I would give to people that are interested in this medicine or finding a practitioner is really trust your gut when working with someone. Do not be in a space of scarcity, like, oh, this is my only chance to do this. There's no one else I have access to this medicine with. Because this person is going to be holding space for you as you are both dying and rebirthing yourself, and possibly imprinting on this person very deeply. And do you want the feeling that you're getting from this person, do you feel like that's the person that you want to be in that space with you? And what kinds of ways are they planning to support you ongoing after the experience? And there's a lot of really important questions you need to ask of people before you sit with them, and that's going across the board, 5-MeO or anything else. The AWARE project is going to be putting out a safety bulletin soon that has recommendations for people to or questions to ask of your practitioner before you work with someone. The Women's Visionary Congress also has some good safety guidelines around this type of thing.
I noticed that recently also on the AWARE project site you had posted a 16-page integration and preparation document.
Yeah, so recently a group called the Conclave, which is a group of 5-MeO practitioners, put out a safety and integration documents around 5-MeO because of all the controversy that's been happening around this medicine and questionable practices. We felt like that to highlight this safety bulletin would be a really appropriate time for this, for people to start to pay attention to this. And there was a call in the community, like, where are the people that are doing this in a good way, and how can we know, as people that might want to be using this medicine, how do we make good choices? So check that out. It's under 5-MeO DMT under the AWARE Project website, so you can get all that information there.
So James, hold on one second, because I want to bring Hamilton's voice in, if we may.
I just want to make a quick comment on
Yeah,
that, is that there are no new protocols being developed for 5-MeO DMT. I mean, psychedelic protocols have been being developed for 40, 50 years, and they're in place. There's therapists and people working with other psychedelics. So there's already a pretty set protocol. James Fadiman talks about it in his Psychedelic Explorers book, and there's plenty of information out there on the kind of way you want to work with psychedelics with other people. Now, I think what we're seeing in the 5-methoxy-DMT community is certain practitioners are straying outside of those long existing guidelines, which is why other people are concerned. So I think this idea that we're creating something from the ground up is actually incorrect, and really we should just be more using the protocols that have already been developed for this kind of stuff that started way back in the 50s.
Hamilton, you got a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree and disagree. I think it's half incorrect because unlike other psychedelics, 5-MeO DMT does not have an especially long history. I know that there are some people that believe that there is some indication of ancient use. I've looked at the historical record pretty carefully. I've seen absolutely no convincing evidence of 5-MeO DMT, or at the very least of bufo alvarius venom use before 1982. So this is, and I'm sort of curious about what Rafael was referring to in terms of cultural appropriation, because
Yeah.
the culture of this venom is from Texas in the 80s.
Well, I
at
think
least
I
in
think
Mexico.
I think that's his point, is that toad shamans are trying to appropriate a culture that doesn't exactly
Right.
exist.
Okay, yeah, maybe by, yeah.
Well, and let me lead that to the next question. In your recent episode on the Sonoran Desert toad, you seem to be pressing the feature practitioner away from the use of toad bufotoxin. Would that be an accurate assessment? And what do you feel are some of the important ethical considerations in terms of using bufotoxin versus plant extracts or synthetics?
Well, it's hard to say exactly what the right thing to do is, because there isn't ecological data that explicitly shows that human intervention is somehow interfering with the toad population. So it's kind of a guess. The toads are dying, but there's so many different variables to consider regarding electric lights that bring the toads to the sides of roads where they're then hit by cars, or use of pesticides, or climate change, or people hunting them and milking their venom and possibly hurting them in the process, or selling them as pets. I mean, there's a lot of things to consider. So I don't want to go ahead and say that humans are directly responsible, or at the very least drug-using humans are immediately responsible
Definitely
for
humans.
the decline in bufo various populations. But this is a nice situation where this isn't something like ibogaine, where it's, synthetically essentially impossible to produce. It has to come from a plant. There's no effective way to produce ibogaine synthetically, but 5-MeO-DMT can be made from melatonin very, very easily. So there isn't a need to depend on these toad populations. And on top of that, there isn't a lot of chemical analysis that's been done on these venoms. I did a little bit myself last year, and before that, you have really early 1950s research done in Italy on the venom, and almost nothing in between. So people don't really even know very much about the composition. They know that there are these steroidal lactones that are sometimes called bufotoxin, and they know that there's 5-MeO-DMT, sometimes maybe bufotenine, sometimes other things. But if you're giving this to humans, I would want as much consistency as possible, because people are talking about the venom as if it's a homogeneous material. 100 milligrams of the venom could be completely different depending on the region that the toad lives, depending on whether it's been milked previously. And
Stresses of the toad.
what is that?
The stress that the toad's been under.
Yes, and the stress, if it's had been a happy toad or a stressed toad. I mean, these are all things to consider. So given that these variables are not necessary because it can be produced synthetically, I would love to see more work done with the synthetic material and with attempts to reconstitute the natural material by seeing what happens if you add a small amount of bufotenine, which unfortunately is illegal in Mexico and makes things a bit more complicated, or 5-MeO-NMT, or O-acetyl serotonin, which is something, or rather, serotonin O-sulfate, sorry, which is something that I found in the venom that I collected in Mexico. So there's a lot of chemical and pharmacological complexity to consider, and that should be ironed out if this is going to be used by people therapeutically.
Yeah, I've got a question for you, Hamilton. Do you think that which is safer, synthetic or toad?
I think that I would be very surprised if the synthetic weren't safer, but I can't say with certainty, if only because of the certainty in dosing. I mean, you can't underestimate, given how unpredictable these medicines can be, you can't underestimate the importance of knowing at the very least how much of it someone has taken.
So in that recent episode, you partook on camera of that toad bufotoxin. How was that experience for you? I think I recalled "wow" being the response.
Yeah, it was good. It was so good that it was unbelievable in the literal sense. People did not believe it. And I was getting all these messages from people saying, like, man, I used to be a fan of your work, but then when you faked that toad venom trip, I lost all respect for you after that. And I don't know what to say. I mean, I don't know what they expected from me. I was unconscious for 8 minutes. That was cut because it wouldn't have made for very good television.
Makes sense.
Can I just jump in for a second? Because I was just chuckling a minute ago before we started. It was that the irony that the three of us are up here as panelists is kind of funny, because I'm sure all of us would, if someone said, oh, 5 or 10 years ago that we would be here talking about this, we'd be like, what, you're lying, because I know all of us started off as very skeptical people, because I know, I was a really adamant atheist for most of my life, and very skeptical of spirituality and religion, and this medicine changed everything for me. So it's a facet, and I think that's why I feel so that is why I feel so passionately about this, and but I just think it's kind of funny that we've got these kind of atheists.
Also more interesting.
It is very interesting.
Well, and another aspect about the Psychedelic Toad episode, it seemed to raise quite a deal of controversy online in the 5-MeO community, especially in regards to potentially unsafe location chosen by the practitioner featured in that episode. And I wanted to see if you would care to comment. Oroc, I know you had some comments on that as well.
I just think smoking toads standing up in a riverbed's pretty stupid.
Yes.
So, Ashley, would you care to comment on ideas around safe location?
But, well, could I just say one more thing about it? Just
Yeah.
one quick thing. I mean, I do...
Made for good television.
Oh, all right.
That's great TV.
But, from a journalistic perspective, I've had to cultivate this sort of laissez-faire attitude where I do sometimes see people doing things that are slightly unsafe, and part of my work as a documentarian entails not interfering with people's natural behaviors and allowing them to do what they would do otherwise. So this wasn't the first time he'd used 5-MeO-DMT. He actually flew down with a day's notice when he was offered the opportunity, and he was considered by Dr. Jerry to be one of his most experienced disciples. So he made that choice. He knew what he was doing. I wouldn't have done it. I didn't do it, but I also didn't feel that it was my place to tell him not to when he was in fact far more experienced with toad venom than I am.
Did you feel unsafe at all in that particular? I mean, you were pretty close to a boulder, which was concerning.
And in the water.
Well, Hamilton wasn't in the water.
I was
Yeah, but close.
I was afraid, but I didn't feel unsafe.
Okay.
But yes, as far as I know, there's maybe 4 or 5 recorded 5-MeO-DMT associated deaths, and 2 of them are people that combined 5-MeO-DMT with an MAOI in one instance.
Do not do it.
Yeah,
Do not.
Yeah.
Serotonin shock syndrome.
There are also 2 that are known for people who did 5-MeO-DMT by themselves in water.
Yes, that's what I was about to say. So don't do that either.
Well, which kind of calls for the idea of a responsible practitioner on hand. Oroc, I know you've got some things you'd like to say about that in terms of facilitation. So,
I don't even know why I'm up here. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a facilitator, and really, I'm pretty much a mystic. I don't particularly like the word medicine being associated with these compounds. I think 5-MeO-DMT is barely a psychedelic. It kind of exists in a category all of its own. And I appreciate the work being done on people using it like a medicine, but I'm way more interested in giving it to healthy people than I am giving it to anybody who's ill. That's just not my cup of tea. And I tend to be I really think a lot of this controversy about all the facilitators and everything would evaporate if we had a readily available supply of the compound. My facilitator was a brown envelope that turned up in the mail. And nobody knew anything about it in those days. I did a bit of research. I'd been looking for DMT for years, and then a friend called up my fiance in the middle of the night, and he was ranting and raving that he had just smoked this DMT and had this life-changing experience, which happens when you smoke 5-MeO-DMT. You want to ring up all your friends and let them in on the secret. And I was like, oh, wow, DMT, where'd he get that? And he's like, oh, he just ordered it online. And I was like, no way. So that was how I actually found out about research chemicals companies. It's funny, I'm beginning to think we're going to look at the late 90s and early 2000s as being the golden age of psychonauts. when things were really at their smallest in many ways, but the most serious, and you had the research chemical companies, and you had a lot of pretty serious psychedelic investigation going on in my mind without a lot of the new age trappings and the medicalization effects that we're starting to see now as psychedelics become more mainstream. I am a great believer that you should have enough experience with psychedelics to have developed your own protocols with various stepping stone psychedelics before you really go to work with something like 5-methoxy-DMT. I think you should have a strong circle of friends, that, you know, a group, your own group. We're all our own, I guess we're all our own facilitators, is my point. And I think the best facilitator is a registered nurse who can put you in the recovery position. Because the singularly biggest danger with 5-MeO-DMT is that you could vomit. And, you'll be unconscious. And that doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. And I always try and make sure that people aren't nervous and drinking a bunch of tea or stuff beforehand, you know. I personally, and I'm probably going to get some slack for saying this, I always smoke 5-methoxy-DMT alone and have for 15 years now. And the reason for that is it's an extraordinarily personal event. It's my time with God, is the way I put it. And when I come out of that, you know, the ego is desperately trying to put itself back together. So the easiest way for the ego to put itself back together is with shared experience. So whoever you're in the room with, as you come out in this very tender, baby-like state, you immediately latch on to the other people in the room and you start rebuilding yourself around those shared experiences. It's inevitable. Now, if there's nobody else in the room, I don't do that. And I get to lie in a place in between the two worlds for a little longer, where I'm conscious of my environment, but I'm still somewhat in what I call the Akashic field, the holographic state. I find that fascinating, and that's what I try and work on. 5-MeO-DMT is so powerful for me that I can barely do it like once every couple of years. And it's interesting that I did it a lot early on, obviously. But then, it just got too powerful. And it's kind of like you get the message, oh, you're back again? What, you didn't get the message the first time around? So then it's like the kid gloves are off, you know. The first couple of times they treat you kind of nice. Yeah, so, you know, I think we could, if I know there's some very good minds working on the organic extraction paradox at the moment, because 5-MeO-DMT is not as easy to extract as DMT. And if we had easy extraction formulas and at the...
Plants? What do you mean by extraction?
Well, the way most DMT's been made from Mimosa hystilis or acacia.
Okay.
We're not smoking synthetic DMTs, we're mostly smoking DMT that's been extracted from plant material. So I think if we can find a suitable candidate and a suitable procedure that makes that readily available through the internet, I mean, I think it's great that there's high school kids all over the world making their own DMT. That's just fantastic.
Thank you, James.
That's a breakthrough. That's just a breakthrough.
Thank you for that
science.
sage counsel. Don't try this at home.
We're trying to be good ambassadors here.
So what I would like to do, there are so many interesting areas that we could explore right now, but I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. So if people want to start lining up, I'm going to ask our presenters just another quick question to cover, and if people want to start lining up in the aisles, if you have questions, we'll take those in just a moment. The main one I want to talk about, and Rock, you kind of commented on this, but you know, recently in Michael Pollan has been giving quite a few interviews. My favorite one was with Stephen Colbert, when Colbert said that the ego should perhaps be considered a controlled substance. But in the chapter of your book, Heaven and Hell, you explore the darker, more challenging, sometimes some would call it negative side, in terms of 5-MeO-DMT. Can you just each share a couple of your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not entirely sure that Michael Pollan went to what we'd call the hell state. I think he was more awestruck than anything, or in the correct terminology of the word, mostly because he doesn't mention any lasting bad effects. Mm-hmm. Like, it's fine to be awestruck, and to come out of the experience on your knees. That's really the way it's supposed to work. It's when people can't sleep and they are having the flashbacks and there's kind of this reoccurring resonance that's what I consider to be this when they've really gone to the hell state. And it's usually exactly that the ego refuses to disintegrate and people just get dragged through hell hanging on.
Because the ego refuses to let go.
That's my interpretation, yeah.
Ashley, you want to comment on
Yeah,
that,
well,
or just
and-
integration regarding that?
Yeah, that was exactly right. It seemed like he maybe lacked a little bit of integration because it was like, I went through this experience and I felt gratitude at the end, but then, and if he, I mean, I don't know who he
And it
still
was his,
did
it was
by,
his
but-
third
but-
psychedelic experience.
Yeah, so, contextualizing the experience is such a huge part of it. And so, I think he needs a little help in contextualizing what he went through.
Anything about your integration? Hamilton, you want to comment?
Yeah, the first time I used 5-MeO-DMT, I was actually pretty well aware of what I was getting into. I'd read Tikal. I knew that even though it contains DMT in its name, that it was very different and much more powerful and less classically psychedelic. And I knew all the things that you're supposed to do when you have a difficult psychedelic experience in terms of letting go or accepting death. I knew all those things intellectually. But when the time actually came to do those things, it didn't work. I was in a panicked, near-death experience saying, I'm okay with death, it's okay, but I wasn't okay with it. And it was very, very frightening. Traumatic would maybe be too strong of a word, right. But it was difficult enough that I thought that maybe I'm one of these people that just responds very negatively to the substance, and why would I even try it again after having such a profoundly negative experience?
And did you?
I did, and it was fantastic. But
if at first you don't succeed.
I mean, it's a little, I don't know, but it's it is genuinely pharmacologically a very different type of psychedelic, and it's one where we don't have a history and a framework to figure out exactly the best way to use it. We're still learning, and I think that everyone that uses it should be aware of that potential for a difficult experience.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So I want to turn to our audience members. I want to use the Fadiman rule. Remember, a question is a sentence with a question mark at the end. Let's start on this side of the room. Can we start here?
Okay. Yeah.
Please.
Hi, thank you, yes. Perhaps, Hamilton, you're best suited to answer this based on what you just said. I've tried 5-MeO once, and it completely blew me open. I since have tried sort of these DMT pens, and they're completely different experiences. It's super visual versus...
Well, DMT is a different drug.
So it's a completely different drug? Does it,
100%
So my question is, what's happening, like which receptors are they operating on that are so different? And if that's the case, why is DMT included in this name?
In its name? Oh, because, okay, so DMT is dimethyltryptamine. People sort of confuse this a little bit. Sometimes people will call DMT NN-DMT and 5-MeO-DMT 5-MeO-DMT. They're actually all NN-DMT, so that makes it even more confusing, as is psilocin, as is psilocybin, all of them, as is bufotenine.
Serotonin, they're all tryptamines.
Yeah, but these are all actually NN-DMTs. So there's like, oh, okay, there's a molecule behind me. But it's a very, there's a bigger chemical difference between DMT and 5-MeO-DMT than there is between DMT and psilocin. I mean, they're very, very different molecules, so you shouldn't ever expect them to be similar. And the difference, if this is ultra reductionist, but as far as people understand it, it seems to be that DMT has more of a 5-HT2A target, and 5-MeO-DMT has more of a 5-HT1A target. But the effect of these 5-HT1A agonists are very complicated. It's a different type of serotonin receptor altogether. It's an autoreceptor, and it's something that people still don't fully understand.
Some say 5-MeO-DMT is 4 to 10 times more powerful than NN-DMT. I will hold that 5-MeO-DMT is exponentially stronger than NN-DMT. Let's take a question over here.
Thank you, everyone. My question is for Hamilton, if you know of the other component parts to the extraction from Phalaris grass. And then the second part of that is, what is the method of extraction currently being used to obtain 5-MeO-DMT from Phalaris?
I've never worked with Phalaris grass or analyzed Phalaris grass. I know that in the past, one of the concerns was the gramine content in Phalaris, but there actually isn't very strong evidence that I'm aware of that gramine is actually toxic. So in terms of the chemical composition, my answer would be just type it in Google Scholar, and it's not there. Okay, then maybe it's a mystery, and hire an analytical chemist to figure it out for you.
There are some beta carbolines that are also found within the Phalaris grass, and I'm not a chemist, so I don't know this, but I've seen the graphs, and there's some spikes on the beta carbolines in addition to the 5-MeO-DMT.
And just for some context around the Phalaris grass, it's an invasive weed grass that has 5-MeO in it, but in very low concentrations. So as far as a natural source of 5-MeO-DMT that is sustainable could be an option. It just takes a lot of grass to make it. So
I know the original DMT extraction formula that Jim DeCorn published in the Entheogen Review, which was literally the very first one that then got spread all around the internet and everything else, was mistakenly actually an extraction for 5-MeO because it used Phalaris grass. And that afterwards they had to change it. So if you can actually find the original Entheogen Review copy that has that might help you.
And then lastly, just for anyone that is legally able to synthesize it, depending on what country you live in, there's a brilliant chemist named Simon Brandt who published a procedure for reductive amination of tryptamine with formaldehyde and sodium cyanoborohydride that's very high yielding, so you can actually make it from melatonin using that procedure, and it's probably ultimately the most effective procedure of all.
Thank you for that.
Just wanted to get that out there.
Somebody's taking notes, right? Next question, please.
Hey guys, thank you, by the way. So I'm curious about, you guys have, obviously you have history and an understanding of the substance. Have you ever witnessed or heard of anyone who hasn't been able to sort of come back, like hasn't been able to reintegrate back into this reality?
You want to talk about Dark and Shining Wild?
Yeah, well, I mean, the most famous case is Robert Augustus Masters' book, Darkness Shining Wild, where he talks about sort of his 10-year battle to reintegrate. But in terms of coming back, I mean, people come back, a lot of times they find they fall back into the experience when they go to sleep. So they're terrified of going to sleep.
Reactivations is the technical term.
Masters didn't go to sleep for months. That's the most common sort of side effect that I'm aware of. It's not that anyone goes into that state and then just stays in that state. They come back to a conscious state, but they can have integration problems.
And I've only heard of a few cases that are very extreme, but it can cause a psychotic break. It can cause severe paranoia. And so obviously in the same kind of, if you're entering into the psychedelic world, having any pre-existing conditions around maybe bipolar or schizophrenia.
OCD?
Yeah. And so it's quite rare and unfortunately hard to screen for, at least if you besides those pre-existing conditions. But it is quite rare, but that is a huge asterisk that people need to be aware of and take into consideration before entering into this work.
Reactivation can happen in about 15 to 20% of people who do this medicine. In some people, it lasts a few days. Some people, it could last a few weeks. For some, it can last somewhat longer. But those slightly longer episodes is an extremely small percentage of people, like under 1%.
Yeah, but make sure any practitioner you're talking to has an empathy for the negative experience.
Absolutely.
Because the ones that just deny it, or
Right.
tell you that that you might not, oh, it's not going to happen to you because you're going to go do it with them, or that's not true. So I really feel very strongly that practitioners that do not have enough empathy for the negative side of the experience and tend to try and just brush it under the carpet at the moment.
Absolutely.
I get a lot of people writing to me who are having tough experiences. And it seems to be on an increase from what I'm seeing. And I don't know if that's because there's more of it out there, more people giving it around, but it's also because as it gets better known, there's a different kind of person starts looking for it as well. So it gets tricky. I've only ever seen one person have a bad experience, and I didn't want to give it to them. And I was convinced otherwise. And I was kind of like, yeah, who are you to play the shaman? You know, you are here, he's there, you got it, this is his chance. And then he had a really, really bad, rough ride. And I witnessed that. And I was like, actually, so my own instinct was quite correct. And I think that's one of the reasons I like the personal exploration model with friends and your own community versus the random practitioner who just rolls into town model, because you as your own friends, you know the guy that shouldn't be given the strong-headed owl, or the guy that really needs half as many mushrooms as everybody else.
Which really leads to the idea that integration is critical, and follow up with people who've had the experience, and having some kind of system where people can integrate effectively. Materials for integration is essential.
And community is really important for integration.
Absolutely.
To have a community that you can talk about these things with and feel that you're not losing your mind because other people have gone through it.
Which is why groups like Interspace Integration exist in places like Los Angeles, for people to be able to come in and have those kinds of dialogues. Or practitioners should be able to provide those kinds of services for people who work with them. Over on this side of the room? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I think this question would be best suited for James, but feel free for any of you. So as compared to other psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, and DMT, the visions that you go to are extremely complex and colorful, and the metaphors that I've seen just try to describe 5-MeO is like the original primordial well, or the clear light, or some people even say purgatory, or basically like the transition point between like birth and death. So my question is, what exactly do you think these dimensions like literally are? Like, what is this you're transported to?
Wild speculation.
I was very fortunate to be friends with Nick Sand, the chemist who invented Orange Sunshine LSD in the last few years of his life. And I've had some great Nick was also the first guy that figured out you could smoke DMT and was a lifetime advocate of DMT. And he wasn't a great fan of 5-MeO initially because he had a seizure on it, on about 6 micrograms, just a tiny amount. But the way he ended up describing it to me is he would call DMT the fullness, and he would call 5-methoxy-DMT the void. And I, in my lectures, like to compare it to the Kundalini, where the 6th chakra, to me, is the realm of DMT, which is the realm of mythology, where any god, any goddess, any hell, any heaven, any earthly delight can be imagined, conceived, seen. So you can witness God and you can be in the presence of the gods and goddesses, but there's still separation between you and the object. 5-MeO DMT, the void, operates at the 7th chakra, which is the place where all separation ceases. So it's truly the mystical experience, and there is no, you can call it union, but there's no separation. You and God are one. There's no you anymore. And I find it fascinating that we think these two compounds could be endogenous, and that one produces the mystical experience, one produces the mythological experience. And all of our spirituality is this tension between the mystical and the mythological. So that ends up being the source of much of what we have built up culturally. It wouldn't surprise me.
And that's a piece that's really important to get, is that this molecule exists inside of you and I right now. We have the ability to produce it endogenously. And when we do, that connects us to that infinite source of all existence.
Well,
and
there's
creation.
still considerable debate about how much is being produced.
Yeah,
and whether or not,
it's
whether or
if
not,
any at all is being produced is
yeah.
also.
What's that?
There's no, well, actually there is evidence that 5-MeO-DMT has been found in the urine of schizophrenic people, but that's pretty old literature, and there's a lot of tryptamines that are biosynthesized in the periphery, so just because something's in your urine doesn't mean that it was in your brain, and we haven't done any direct experiments on humans to see whether or not these tryptamines play a role in regulating altered states of consciousness. Even, it's almost at this point, it's become like a factoid that's passed around that DMT is present in every human's brain. It's never been found in a human brain. And as far as I know, the only animal whose brain it has been found in is in rats.
Right. Yeah. Well,
And pretty
unfortunately,
recently.
yeah. Unfortunately, Rick Strassman hypothesized in his book that DMT was released at birth and death, and all these different things, and then people through the grapevine, this kind of got lost that this was a hypothesis. But we have we don't know
You
if
can't-
it was. Yeah. How would you measure that it was present at birth and death?
You can't blame Rick Strassman that hippies can't read properly, though.
So, just spreading a little bit of accurate information there.
But the fact that it is, there is definitely some indications that it could be endogenous. We think DMT is endogenous. We're not sure about 5-MeO, and it should be something that we're studying. This is why all the band, as soon as we can really get
Research.
the science is opened up, there's so many fascinating avenues of research to go down.
And a good hypothesis would be that it is either DMT or 5-MeO is released during sleep and dreams. Again, hypothesis. But because when people do have a reactivation experience, it's typically at night when they're sleeping. So maybe there's an endogenous production that then causes the reactivation.
We have time for one, maybe two more questions.
Hey, my question is just if...
Can you speak into the mic, please?
Is this good? My question is, for somebody who's curious about this, but also very scared, is there a way to mentally prepare? James mentioned stepping stones. What about the stepping stones?
Man, I just think it's good to have a good basis in psychedelics before you go all the way to the toad. But I also say if there's one drug you're going to do in your life, then you might as well do that one. And I've actually met people who followed that advice, which is quite fascinating. Like I said, it doesn't really fall into the easy classifications of anything. It's truly a mystical experience, and in history, no one's ever really been prepared for a mystical experience. So,
one quick suggestion, if I may. There's a great website. It's called dmtsite.org. Com. It happens to be Oroc site, and educating oneself as deeply as possible about the experience from reading these kinds of reports. Ashley, you got more?
It's funny you ask me that because I'm always afraid I'm ruining it for people if they read my book first.
Read the book first.
It doesn't ruin it.
It won't ruin it. Read the book first.
I would say that mindfulness practices, yoga, all these things point to yourself. So the more you can get clear with yourself, that you can sit with yourself, that's the best you can do. Kundalini yoga practice can strengthen your kind of resolve and your connection to yourself. Yoga, meditation, other psychedelics, it's just a reflection. And so, I think that 5-MeO is kind of one thing, one aspect of this sort of healthy diet of self-inquiry. And 5-MeO, while it can be just pop you all the way to the top, and then you bypass a lot of the stuff that you need to work on. So when you can combine that with other mindfulness practices and working with a therapist or sitting with ayahuasca and just sitting with all your stuff to make sure you're not bypassing stuff, I think is really important. So thank you for your question.
And Ashley's response is totally correct. Like being feeling healthy and balanced
Absolutely.
is the best place to be. I find like I don't set a day and time when I'm going to smoke 5-MeO DMT. It's just like the day and time pops up, and I'm like, oh, this is a really good, like this is the day. I feel everything's lined up, and if you can sort of work with that a little bit, you'll probably be fine.
And lastly, I would say that there's no rush. It's not, whenever anyone presents something as the greatest or the most powerful or the most profound or the most spiritual, it seems like a challenge, and you might want to take that challenge because you want to test yourself in some way, but there's really nothing to be gained from that approach. There's no rush. Become very comfortable with other psychedelics beforehand, I would suggest, because I think the more fear that you have going into the experience, the more likely that the experience will be negative, but maybe not.
One last piece that I'd like to add before we close up, it's along the lines of what both James and Ashley said, is really have your life in order. This is medicine for well people. Which is a phrase that Bob Jesse uses, which I really respect. One other place I would steer you, there's an online document called 5-MeO DMT, Recommended Model for Best Practices, that's been designed for both participants and practitioners, and that's a really good piece of information to take a look at. So I want to thank everybody, thank all our panelists. Let's give them a big hand. Thank Brad Adams and the entire team here at LAPSS. And thank you all for being here.
Thanks, everyone.